After Skinner, it's worth looking at probably the other most famous behaviorist, who's Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov won the Nobel Prize for his work, which is so famous you've probably heard of it. You've heard about the dog that learned to salivate. Now, in order to understand what Pavlov did and did not do, it's necessary to query his terms. In work done in this mode, there's talk of stimulus and response. Don't take those as simply existing terms. They are very, very problematic terms. A stimulus implies that I know I do something to a dog or a person. Its response, interpreting what it does next as a response to my stimulus, is my interpretation. Much work in behaviorism was cast in terms of stimulus and response, sometimes abbreviated to SR. And this was a framework within which the acquisition, modification, and extinction of habits could be framed. In the famous experiments that won him the Nobel Prize, Pavlov produced a behavioral change in a dog. The behavior here now is chosen as salivation, not salvation, salivation, which means the generation of spit. When the dog is hungry and is presented with food, the dog salivates. This is a pre-existing behavior presumed to be, in some sense, natural. The dog also knows nothing of bells, and if you ring a bell at the dog, it doesn't know what the hell you're doing. By repeatedly pairing the sound of the bell with the presentation of food to a hungry dog, over time, we might say the dog cottons on. The dog comes to associate the imminent arrival of food with the sound of the bell. And thereafter, there comes a point at which the sound of the bell generates salivation in the dog. Now, that sequence of events can be interpreted in very different ways. Pavlov's own interpretation of this, or rather the public perception of Pavlov's interpretation of this, makes for a good story. The unconditioned stimulus, that's a term, here is the food. It's assumed to be, we call it an unconditioned stimulus because it produces a response in the absence of any training. The conditioned stimulus is the sound of the bell, and it eventually produces a response after training. And this seems to be the transfer of the meaning of food from the food to the bell. And some might have looked at this and said, ooh, look at that. This is, it's like what humans do when they learn to associate meanings with words. It's like symbolization. The bell isn't intrinsically about food, but it begins to attract the meaning of being about food. There's Pavlov in his lab, showing off, and one of the few cases in which we'll see women involved here. It's notable that most behaviorist research was done on animals by men. Later on, we'll find other varieties of psychology that have their problems with not actually studying people. But I'd like to present an alternative take on Pavlov's work, retold here in this video by, on the right, Heinz von Förster, on the left, Umberto Maturana. This is from a little informal chat they had. I hope YouTube don't remove this on copyright ground. Let's listen to Heinz.
Fascinating experiments to establish the intelligence of animals. I think the most beautiful thing is the Pavlov studies to getting the conditioned reflex thing going. Yeah? He had a dog, putting a dog on a table, and there was an assistant in a white coat. The assistant showed the dog a piece of meat, and when the dog looked at it, of course, he was looking forward. He salivated, a lot of saliva was coming up, and then the assistant rang a bell. Okay, very good. They do this 10 times, and then the assistant enters the room, rings the bell, and the dog salivates. This was for dog, the proof of conditional reflex. The dog can transfer the ringing of the bell to the meat without being even shown the meat.
He means that from the meat to the bell.
Symbolization. And of course he got for that the Nobel Prize. A Polish experimental psychologist said Pavlov wrote his experimental conditions so well in his lab books that I can repeat his experiments exactly as he carried it out. So Konorski did exactly the experiment. The lab assistant with the same white coat, the dog at the table next to the window, a bell standing next to the table, assistant going with the meat, with the bell, meat and bell. And now comes the experimentum crucis, where no meat is shown, but only the bell is around. Konorski took the clapper out of the bell without the assistant knowing that. So the assistant goes in, grabs the bell, no sound is coming out, but the dog salivates. So Konorski concluded the ringing of the bell was a stimulus for Pavlov, for the dog.
Not for the dog.
But unfortunately, he didn't get the Nobel Prize for that.
No.
I think the point that Heinz von Förster is making here is extremely important. I said at the start that to interpret one thing as a stimulus is in the domain of the scientist, not in the domain of the dog. The scientist had decided in advance that it was the sound of the bell that the scientist was manipulating and that therefore was going to be held responsible for effects. The dog knew nothing of these experimental plans. The dog is enfolded in the continuous activity of life, in which such things as the presence of the experimenter, the time of day, the physical setting in the room, the angle of the light coming in the window, all these are all part of the unfolding of experience of the dog. The sound of the bell is one element among it. And so there was no shortage of cues, as we might say, that this is going to be one of those times where you normally hear the sound of the bell. This is what von Förster means when he says the bell was a stimulus, but for Pavlov, not for the dog. I think it's a devastating critique of the notion of stimulus and response. And make sure you understand the logic of it. If Pavlov does something and the dog does something else, it doesn't follow that what Pavlov did, or what Pavlov thinks he did, caused the dog to do whatever the dog did. And this problem arises every time we use those words stimulus and response. And this problem lies over the whole of the behaviorist paradigm, or paradigms. We'll just look at Skinner and Watson, Skinner and Pavlov. I'll put something about Watson in the required reading. But behaviorism had, by this stage, lots of problems. It looked like an ointment full of flies. It was a response to undisciplined scientific activity. It tried to create a framework within which one could be uber sciencey, super science men. But it didn't work. It was effective in developing methods for influencing people, as we see in behavior and behavioral marketing today. But as a psychology, it was miserable. It denied pretty much all of the richness that we associate with our living, with our experiential lives. As a theory of learning, it was impoverished and considered as a form of proto-psychology. It addressed behavior, but it didn't address experience at all. Things came to a head after the Second World War, in a period we'll turn to in the next video, where the intellectual landscape concerned with cognitive science changed fundamentally. One very important move in this, which is worth mentioning at this point, is a book written by B.F. Skinner, which took on the topic of language. Now, language is a particularly human kind of activity, you might agree. So this represented a significant extension beyond his work on animals. He tried to come at language as an acquired set of behaviors, using the concepts he had developed working with animals. So on Skinner's view, to speak English is to have a set of behaviors that allowed you to respond appropriately during an English conversation, and the way you had these was by having a history of prior conversations, presumably in which some kinds of responses had more favorable outcomes than others. As a way of approaching language, this was not powerful, to put it mildly. I think there are still points that Skinner is making that may be lost as we disregard and move on from this work. I think Skinner's work is more insightful than it's often treated. But a very important thing happened here. There was a response to his book written by a young academic called Noam Chomsky, shown down there on the right. He had just finished his PhD on the theory of syntax, and we'll be meeting Chomsky a lot in what comes next. And he represented a sort of a rationalist perspective on Skinner's empiricist agenda. So Skinner is emphasizing the role of the experience in the acquisition of habits. For Skinner, the dog is more, or the learning infant in this case, is more or less a blank slate on whom habits are inscribed through patterns of recurrent interaction with others. Chomsky took a position with respect to language that fundamentally changed all this. He said behavior theories can never account for how children learn language. One thing to note is that language is not just a set of habits. If you were speaking only out of habit, you would never contribute anything novel to a conversation, and you would never make up a sentence like this one I'm speaking, which has never before been spoken in the history of humanity. I think we'd have to check, right? So language is inherently creative. It's not merely parroted, and we'll revisit Chomsky's arguments later when we turn to language, but this is a landmark exchange that more or less can be associated with the death of behaviorism as a paradigm in the Western academy. As I said, not in business, but in the world of scientific research conducted within universities. So in the next video, we're going to turn to that significant change that happened after the Second World War. We'll have to get used to that one.